Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Levon Aronian and Alexander Grischuk. This was played in the 2007 World Chess Championship in Mexico City in the United States. And without further ado, let's look at this game. Aronian starts by playing d4 and knight f6 by Grischuk, c4, e6, and now knight f3. d5 by Grischuk, and after bishop g5 we go into a somewhat queen's gambit decline, except Aronian has not played the move knight c3. h6, we have a trade on f6, and knight bd2, just normal development. Knight d7, g3, and here Grischuk plays an interesting move. He goes for g5, and I can see the idea with the g5 move. He's trying to play this move g4, and essentially he's going to kick the knight away, and he has a threat on the d4 pawn. But it seems a bit too early, and also Aronian can defend against this. He could have played e3 to defend d4, or he could just play what he did in the game, which was h3. And h3 guards g5 pawn from advancing, and it makes g5 look like a completely strange move. Bishop g7 by Grischuk, putting more pressure on the d4 pawn and just developing the bishop. Rook c1, and now c5. Grischuk is trying to break the position open. Unfortunately, this c5 move does mean that he would technically lose a pawn. If Aronian wanted to, he could just play d takes c5, and if Grischuk plays knight takes c5, then there's c takes d5, and this would, of course, have an attack on the c5 knight, and it would be also just winning a pawn. You might make the argument that after d takes c5, queen takes b2 is playable, but this would just allow a lot of more weird positions to occur, where after c6, b takes c6, rook takes c6. First of all, there is an isolated pawn for Grischuk. Aronian can just develop his bishop calmly and castle, and this d5 pawn is the center of attention for both sides because it's a weakness for black and a potential way that white can get an advantage. So I think that c5 was not really the best move, but Aronian doesn't even care. He just plays the move e3 and just defends the d4 pawn. Castles by Grischuk, bishop g2, and now b6. So getting ready to fianchetto the bishop on b7. C takes d5, e takes d5, and castles. Bishop to b7 and rook to e1. And okay, Aronian is getting ready to push the pawn on e3 to e4. Rook f to d8 and g4. And this g4 move is kind of getting a bit of a grip on the f5 square, and this can be quite useful if you ever think about remaneuvering your knight to a square like f5, because in this case, for black, the weakest square in his position is technically f5. So if black can somehow prevent white from getting one of his pieces into the f5 square, then that's what black should do. But if white can get one of his pieces into the f5 square, then that's what white should do. So h5 by Grischuk. And h5 is sacrificing a pawn, but he's doing it so that maybe there is some way that he can get rid of that grip on the f5 square. And Aronian just takes the pawn. And even though he does get doubled pawns, after knight h2 and this knight coming to g4, that extra pawn on h5 won't even matter that much. In fact, Aronian is even going to give the pawn back up if he manages to land his knight onto the g4 square. The knight on h2 has a lot of potential to go to g4, and when it goes to g4, it's even fine giving up the pawn on h5, and you would just get enough compensation that it wouldn't really matter that you were just given back the pawn. So rook a c8 trying to defend c5, knight f1, and now f5. Knight g3, and the original plan was that if f5 was not played, you would just play knight g3 and knight g4, and maybe there is a potential threat of playing the knight to f5. So we have f5, knight g3, and queen e6, defending the f5 pawn. And knight f3 by Aronian. And Aronian is now attacking the g5 pawn, and queen f6 by Grischuk. dc5, bc5, and b4. And b4 is quite an interesting move, I must say. One reason that b4 could have been played was that if c takes b4, then you are trying to bring this knight into the d4 square. And d4 and f5 in this case would be the weakest squares in black's position. First of all, d4 has enabled this knight to come to the square and also pressure the f5 pawn, And also this b4 pawn can later be captured, and white is essentially going to have a good position, and it's really hard to find any way to change that. So instead of playing c takes b4, Grischuk just plays f4, and he's attacking the knight on g3. E takes f4, g takes f4, and the knight just retreats back to f1. And c4. Grischuk ignores the pawn since he knows that the pawn could later be picked up, and it would only favor Aronian. So knight from 1 to h2. And this is trying to put the knight on g4, and from there the knight can help advance the pawn from h5 to h6. So queen f5 by Grischuk. Knight d4 by Aronian, and queen to d3. Offering a queen trade, but also just trying to get rid of the queen in general, so that there's no trouble on any weak square. Knight to e6, not trading the queens right now, but getting ready to do that. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and now knight to e5. And this is a very interesting decision that Grischuk chose to do. Now, why did he decide to play this knight e5 move? It's because if you save this rook with rook to e8, then after the symbol bishop takes d5, or even knight takes g7, white would definitely get a very good advantage. For instance, bishop d5, rook d5, and now there's an attack on the f4 pawn, there's an attack on the g7 bishop, there's an attack on the d7 knight. You'd have to capture the knight, and after rook takes d7, white just has too much activity, and this is unfavorable for black in many cases. So instead of rook e8, we have knight e5. And this gives up the exchange, but Aronian is going to give up the exchange as well. So after knight d8, rook d8, and knight g4, by Aronian just trying to trade more pieces, Grischuk plays knight d3. And knight d3 is trying to obviously put a knight in the center, maybe try to win the b4 pawn if you have a chance to do it. But Grischuk must have been very surprised when Aronian played rook takes d3, because it gives the exchange back up even though there was really no need to. I mean, this bishop on g2 can be transferred to f1, and from there it would be attacking the d3 knight. And essentially what would happen is that the d3 knight would be captured, eliminated, and there would be really no way for it to find any counterplay from there. But with the combination of the d3 knight and two connected passed pawns on d5 and c4, it's no time to just take a chance and try to play a position being up in exchange but having a very dangerous counterplay as black. So instead, rook takes d3, c takes d3, and rook d1. The pawn on d3 is basically undefendable. If you try playing bishop a6, then bishop f1 can just win it. Instead of defending, bishop c8 was played, and after rook takes d3, d4. And what this is trying to do is use the only remaining passed pawn on the board and trying to somehow create some counterplay. For instance, if bishop f5 is played, trying to attack the rook and push d3, then maybe Grischuk might have something, despite the fact that he is down 2 pawns. So bishop e4, guarding the f5 square, but Grischuk attacks from the other side. Rook a3 and bishop to e2. Now, of course, if you capture this a7 pawn, it is technically playable, because after d3 you can capture this d3 pawn, and after this, then there is ideas of a4 and b5. But instead of taking the risk, Aronian decides to play the move h6, and he's attacking the bishop on g7, and if the bishop moves to a wrong square, then there are chances that there could even be checkmate. For instance, if bishop f8 is played, and after something like rook takes a7, if black does not know what's happening and he plays d3, then the game can just end in checkmate very nicely after knight f6 check and rook to h7. So you can't play that, and instead we have bishop h8. Rook still captures on a7, but the difference is that now the bishop on h8 covers the f6 square. So now there's no real worry of knight f6 check and getting checkmated on h7. So d3, Grischuk is really trying to push his pawn, and he's trying to create as much counterplay as he can. Unfortunately for him, Aronian is a lot faster. h7 check, king to f8, and now bishop g6. So threatening rook f7 check, and at this point there's really nothing to do. d2 was played by Grischuk, just hoping that he could at least queen, and maybe even if he would have to play a position, let's say after bishop c2, d1 queen, bishop takes d1, rook takes d1 check, he is technically down material because there is 4 pawns for the piece. This would have been fine for Grischuk because he still would have had a way to activate his pieces. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and the actual move that was played was rook f7 check, and after king e8, I encourage you to pause the video and find the winning combination for Aronian. Okay, so Aronian finally played the move knight f6 check, and the reason this wins is that after bishop takes f6, Aronian has the very nice and crushing rook g7 check move. And after this move is played, there's absolutely no way that Grischuk is able to win here. Obviously, there's only one move for him, and that is king to f8, but after h8 queen check is played, there's a checkmate, and that's it. So that is why after rook g7 check was played, Grischuk resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory for Levon Aronian. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.